Good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Lupfer, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Citizens Research Council's webinar on our recent report titled Michigan's Overlapping Property Tax Limitations Create an Unsustainable Municipal Finance System. Jill, can you go to the next slide? One more after that. The Citizens Research Council is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is our 105th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit organization, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important public policy topics in Michigan. If you value this webinar and the associated paper, please contribute to the public discourse and help to keep the Citizens Research Council as an objective, independent, credible source of information into the next century. So next slide, please. I want to thank Martin Waymeyer for sponsoring today's event. The firm is transitioning to new leadership, and we look forward to as strong a relationship as we've had with Dave Waymeyer and Roger Martin for years. We wish both of them a long, happy retirement. I want to let you know that we have put a file with the slide deck on the event page for this webinar on our website, crcmich.org, if you want to follow along. Please note that we are recording this session and we will post it to our web page where it will be available for future viewing. I want to let everyone know that we have put the whole audience on mute, except for the presenters, so we will not be able to hear you if you speak. We've received several questions as part of the registration process, and we'll go through those at the end of Jill's presentation. If you have other questions as we go, there's a dialog box on the GoToWebinar software that you can enter it there, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please call our office at 734-542-8001. So what are we here for? Our recent report retrospectively analyzed the growth of property tax base and tax revenues for a number of cities and townships to examine the effects of the Headlee Amendment revenue limitations and the taxable value assessment limit. This webinar will describe how those tax limitations work, explain their impact on revenue raising capacity of local governments and its consequences, and explore a number of reforms that could make the system more sustainable without diminishing the taxpayer protections created by the limits. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any comments you have. Jill Roof is the primary author of this report and will be our presenter today. She's been with the Research Council since 2005, although she took a few years off to start her family. She's our primary researcher on local government affairs. I encourage everyone to visit our website for all of our analysis of state and local public policy issues. And we have an email notification system that you can sign up for. The easiest way is by texting Facts Matter, all one word, Facts Matter, to 42828. With that, let me hit my mute button and turn this over to Jill.
Thank you, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Jill Roof, and I'm happy to be here with you this morning to talk about our paper on Michigan's overlapping property tax limitations. I want to start by giving you a quick outline of the presentation so you know what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk briefly of Michigan's experience with the property tax and tax limitations, and then detail our report, which evaluated the impact of tax limitations on both local governments and taxpayers using 25+ years of actual property tax data. I'll then discuss our key observations found during the analysis and policy options to improve Michigan's tax limitations and municipal finance system. So as stated, I'm going to briefly discuss Michigan's experience with the property tax and tax limitations, but if you want more detail and more information, please see our report, including in lots of other reports we've done on the property tax over the years. Property taxes are critical across the United States. Michigan places a heavy burden on the property tax to fund all types of local governments, from counties and cities or townships to school districts to special districts and everything in between. As the property tax burden grew over the years, taxpayers have pushed back with limitations to lessen the impact on their wallets and to create more predictability in their annual tax levies. Achieving those goals has come at a cost for local governments. The relationship between the property tax base and real estate markets has been diminished. States generally limit property taxes in one of three ways, which are highlighted on this slide: rate, assessment, or levy limits. Michigan uses all three limitations. Michigan's first attempts to limit property tax burdens addressed tax rates. While these rate limits would appear to provide some real constraints on property taxes, they only apply to certain local governments, unchartered counties, general law townships, and school districts, and they only apply to property taxes supporting general operations. Also, these rate limits have not been enforced consistently over the years. The Headlee Amendment, which is a levy limit, was adopted in 1978 and added 10 new sections to the Michigan Constitution. The most important part of the amendment for our purposes is Article 9, Section 31, which limits local property taxes in two ways. First, it requires voter approval to adopt new taxes or to increase the tax rate of an existing tax. And second, it limits total property tax revenue growth on a jurisdiction-wide basis to the rate of inflation, excluding new construction. It does this by requiring local governments to downwardly adjust or roll back the maximum authorized tax rate if the tax base increases by a larger percentage than the cost of living as measured by inflation. The Headlee Amendment created a check on the growth of overall property tax collections, but it failed to protect individual taxpayers from excessive increases. For example, a 10% increase in one neighborhood might be offset by a similar decrease in another neighborhood. And if this happens, the millage rate would not be rolled back, or at least not by as much, and those property owners facing a 10% increase would still see most of that reflected in their tax bill. Prior to 1993, Headlee roll-ups existed as well. When assessment growth lagged the inflation rate, the millage rate could be rolled back up, though never above the originally authorized tax rate. This practice was prohibited by the law that triggered the school finance reforms voted on as Proposal A of 1994. When Headlee rollbacks occur, local governments can ask voters to approve Headlee overrides and increase their millage rate back up to the originally authorized rate. Proposal A, which was adopted in 1994 and is an assessment limit, layered a new tax limitation onto the general property tax. It created a modified acquisition value system for determining the taxable value of property. It did not replace the Headlee Amendment, but was layered on top of it. It also instituted differential taxation of business and homestead property. Beginning with calendar year 1995, the market value-based system of assessing property was replaced with the modified acquisition value system as the property tax base. Unlike state equalized value, which is linked to the market, taxable value increases for each parcel of property are constitutionally limited to 5% or inflation, whichever is lower, excluding new construction. So as long as you own your property value for tax purposes cannot increase by more than inflation each year. When that property is sold, the tax base reverts back up to state equalized value, and annual changes to taxable value will be capped once again with the new owner. The impetus behind Proposal A included relief from high property taxes. As stated, the Headlee Amendment failed to protect individual taxpayers from large yearly increases, and changing the school finance system so that it was less reliant on the local property tax and provided more equal per pupil funding across the state. For property owners, the most notable impact of Proposal A was the immediate reduction in tax rates, which is evidenced in the bar chart here. Proposal A revised the tax rate adjustment required by the Headlee Amendment because it replaced state equalized value with inflation-limited taxable value when calculating millage rate rollbacks. Taxable value grows more slowly, leading to less tax rate rollbacks. The cap on changes to taxable value for each parcel of property effectively creates a growing gap between state equalized value, which is represented by the teal line, and taxable value, which is the tan line, and you can see the gap in the chart here. The modified acquisition value system instituted by Proposal A provides an element of certainty for taxpayers. They know the maximum amount by which their assessments can increase each year, and therefore they know how much their tax burdens will change. However, this cap also creates horizontal inequities wherein owners of properties with similar market values are treated differently for purposes of taxation based on how long they've owned their home. These two property owners receive the same services for their taxes, even though one pays almost 3 times as much. And examples can be found throughout the state at all property valuations of similarly situated properties in the same jurisdiction paying different tax amounts based on years of ownership. The two property tax limitations work to control taxes in very different ways. The Headlee Amendment limits unit-wide growth of the amount of taxes collected on existing property to the rate of inflation. Proposal A limits growth in the taxable value of individual parcels of property to the rate of inflation. The interaction of the two limitations raises a key question. Is the combination of these limitations together more restrictive to property tax revenue growth compared to the limits imposed by each one individually? To answer that question, we looked at actual property tax data from local governments in 6 counties across the state. Oh, sorry, I seem to have lost my slide presentation. There we go. All right. We selected 41 units total from these 6 counties, and while these cannot begin to represent all 1,800 plus local governments in Michigan, there are sufficient commonalities in their characteristics and the findings to generalize beyond sample size. We used actual property tax data from 1994 to 2020 to model how the tax limitations interacted retrospectively, holding constant policy preferences such as changes to the tax rate. We do this to show how the tax limitations in different scenarios respond to growth in property values over the period with a stable, unchanging tax rate. In real life, the tax rates levied by many local governments have changed with voter approval of new taxes, Headlee Amendment millage reduction overrides, or expiring millages that were not renewed. We applied each unit's 1993 authorized millage rate to actual state equalized values and taxable values to quantify how the two tax limitations operate under 3 different scenarios. The first is a no tax limitation scenario, which shows a scenario based on market value, state equalized value, and the 1993 millage rate if neither the Headlee Amendment nor Proposal A would have been adopted. This scenario provides an upper bound to the model to show how much property tax revenue would be collected with no limitations to moderate growth. The second is a Headlee Amendment scenario, which shows how the Headlee limitations alone impact property taxes based on a 1993 millage rate and yearly tax rate adjustments as calculated based on state equalized value. And the third is a Headlee Amendment and Proposal A scenario, which reflects current law, again with the 1993 millage rate, with levy and assessment limits that restrain property value growth and impact tax revenue growth with yearly tax rate adjustments as calculated based on taxable value. The analyses conducted for each county and municipality provide illustrative scenarios of how Section 31 of the Headlee Amendment and the use of taxable value as created by Proposal A interact to impact the collection of property tax revenue data. While these scenarios are based on actual property tax base and rate data from each community, they are hypothetical and do not reflect actual tax revenue collections. In order to better understand the data and to generalize beyond sample size, we separated the local governments into one of 5 different categories: counties, urban communities, which were all cities, suburban communities, which included cities and townships, exurb communities, which were all townships, and rural communities, which included one small city and townships. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, with its ties to the financial crisis surrounding real estate markets, led to a precipitous decline in property values in many parts of the state, which is unusual during a recession. This impacted most local governments' finances in Michigan. To better understand the property tax data, our analysis looks at how the tax limitations affected revenues in 3 distinct periods. 1, from the adoption of Proposal A in 1994 until the onset of the Great Recession in 2007. 2, as a result of the Great Recession. And 3, in the period since property values started rising after the Great Recession, which was around 2012 for most communities. As stated, the goal of this analysis was to consider how the property tax limitations have affected both local governments that are dependent on tax revenues and the property taxpayers that are footing the bill. For each category of government in the study, we provided examples to show how the different scenarios impact potential property tax revenues with a stable tax rate. For this presentation, I'm only going to highlight 3 of the different examples. The first is Farmington Hills, which is a suburb of Detroit. The graph shows that in Farmington Hills, the 2 tax limitation lines were the same until the Great Recession. At that point, having both tax limitations led to more revenue growth than just having the Headlee Amendment. It's important to note that the revenues from a tax without limitations, the black line, would have recovered to pre-recession levels by 2020. The revenues in the tax limitation scenarios will not return to pre-recession levels for many years, and this is common in our tax scenarios in Southeast Michigan. Also, while revenues are growing again, yearly growth post-recession is much slower than it was pre-recession. The second community is Cambridge Township, an exurb community in Lenawee County. All the exurb communities grew in population over the period, and this growth has allowed for new development, which has allowed for greater tax revenue growth in the different scenarios. In the exurb communities, revenues peaked around 2007 to 2008 and reached their low point in 2012. They are growing again, and while post-recession growth has been slower than it was pre-recession, it has been faster than it was for the suburban communities. As in other types of governments, the pre-recession growth and recessionary decline were greater in Southeast Michigan exurb communities. And the last community highlighted in this presentation is Pickford Township, a rural community in Chippewa County in the Upper Peninsula. Revenues were greater with just the Headlee Amendment before the recession, the teal line, and greater with both the Headlee Amendment and Proposal A after the recession, the tan line. Revenues never declined in Pickford Township in the scenario with both limitations. The rural communities are all outstate rather than in Southeast Michigan, so it's no surprise that the Great Recession was not as impactful. Another thing about rural property is that it does not change hands as often, leading to less pop-ups and less tax rate rollbacks, since they are triggered by property being sold and popping back up to market value. Our report has much more data and graphs if you want to see the scenarios in other communities as well. So this is the part where we talk about some of the things we learned from the data and potential policy options moving forward. First, I want to talk about what is good tax policy. The need and efficacy of limits on property tax revenues will no doubt be judged differently by taxpayers than by local government officials trying to fund services in their communities. The key to good tax policy is that it meets the needs of both taxpayers and government. In general, effective tax policy for local government provides revenues that can grow with the local economy and are adequate to support desired public services, revenues that are stable and predictable, and the ability to minimize the downside risk associated with declining property values. Effective tax policy for taxpayers provides limits on growth in the tax burden, predictability in year-to-year tax bills, an easily understandable process to determine property value and what taxes are owed, and equity with other taxpayers. It is no easy feat to find a scenario where tax limitations work to constrain growth in the tax burden for taxpayers while also providing revenues that align and grow with the local economy. In general, the tax limitations provide predictability for both taxpayers and local governments, as revenues are not just responding to the market. However, if they restrain taxes too much, they may not provide stability or adequacy. The limitations have also impacted how easy it is to understand the property tax system for taxpayers and equity among taxpayers. Not surprisingly, the tax limitation scenarios yield less revenue than the no limitation scenario in all cases. A scenario without limitations did lead to greater revenue declines during the Great Recession, but to significantly more revenues overall. In almost all cases, the scenario with the combination of the Headlee Amendment and Proposal A tax limitations yields more revenue in recent years than the scenario with just the Headlee Amendment. The modified acquisition value system instituted by Proposal A creates reservoirs of taxable value that lessen the impact of lost property values during the Great Recession. This is seen most clearly in rural communities where taxable value growth never declined to reflect declining state equalized value. So in other words, that chart from the beginning with the bar chart and the line showing the gap between state equalized value and taxable value, that gap is not lost tax base, but in fact a reservoir of taxable value that can be tapped into when market values are declining. With the length and depth of the Great Recession, the lessened tax rate rollbacks and reservoir of taxable value enable the additional tax limitation instituted by Proposal A to have a mitigating effect on the Headlee Amendment limitation instead of a compounding effect. That being said, annual growth post-recession is slower than it was pre-recession. The relationship between appreciation of property values and tax revenues is diminishing. This is most pronounced for rural communities as they generally see less turnover in their properties. Without the Great Recession and the property value declines that occurred during it, the numbers might look very different. In most scenarios, the projected revenues are very similar no matter the limitation before the Great Recession. This varied by community, but the Great Recession and its precipitous drop in property values led to the Headlee Amendment restrictions being particularly severe. This is because property values were growing significantly before the recession, causing millage rates to be rolled back so that local governments were collecting tax revenues at much lower rates during and after the recession. Within this system, the end of tax rate roll-ups enacted in 1993 had the strongest influence on limiting taxes. The Great Recession was a unique situation and the only recession in recent history that saw severe property value declines. But for the rare circumstances of the Great Recession, not experienced at any other time in recent history, then the combination of declining property values and Headlee Amendment tax rate rollbacks might not have been as severe. A study by the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments on property tax limitations similarly found that the effects of the Headlee Amendment accelerated 100-fold during the Great Recession. The historic loss in property value reset the Headlee Amendment baseline at a much lower level and created a new normal for local government operations. Even though the Great Recession could not have been predicted when Proposal A was adopted, Proposal A served to mitigate some of the effects of the recession on property values and tax revenues. That being said, Michigan should not base future tax policy on rare events like the Great Recession. The tax limitations restrict local governments from increasing revenues beyond inflation for any reason except for new development. This has been evidenced by the fact that communities with land to develop and additions, such as exurb communities, have done the best and seen the most revenue growth over the last 25 years. Many urban and suburban communities are largely built out, but they have redeveloped land and revitalized neighborhoods and downtowns to invest in their communities. The problem is that they do not see tax revenue growth from this type of investment. Proposal A restricts growth to additions and sales. When property is sold and its assessed value is reverted to market value, the Headlee Amendment treats that pop-up as revenue growth and requires the millage rate to be rolled back. This is preventing communities with turnover in their properties from benefiting from those sales and increases in property values. This system is not sustainable. It leaves no room for revitalization and redevelopment and encourages urban sprawl. Land is finite and all communities will become built out at some point. Vibrant communities need tax systems that allow them to benefit from revitalization and investment in their community. This study purposefully leaves the changing tax rate out of the equation to show what changes in the tax base due to revenues with a stable tax rate. In reality, tax rates were not stable over the period. Anecdotal evidence suggests that some local governments have responded to a restrained tax base by requesting voter approval of higher tax rates, and these requests have been successful. 79% of local tax proposals passed in the May 2021 election. Data also show that in Oakland County, 80% of local units have increased their tax rate since 2007. One example is Farmington Hills, which is detailed on the following graph. This graph highlights actual tax rates and revenues in Farmington Hills compared to the tax rates and revenues in our scenario with both limitations. The actual tax rate that was levied in Farmington Hills went from 9.8 mills in 1996, which included 2 dedicated millages, to 17 mills in 2020, which included 7 dedicated millages. In contrast, in our scenario, the tax rate was not increased and declined slightly with millage rate rollbacks. Now, the scenario tax rate starts out slightly higher because we use the total authorized rate, and local governments don't always levy their full authorized rate. Because of the increased tax rate, actual revenues in Farmington Hills increased 124% from 27 million in 1996 to 61 million in 2020. In the scenario, revenues were much lower and grew only 21% over the entire period, growing more slowly than taxable value overall, which only grew 1.2% per year. Farmington Hills is just one example, but there are others. Additionally, ad valorem special assessments, which are separate from property taxes and are levied by townships and small cities, have grown over the period as well. It appears that constraining the tax base puts pressure on the tax rate. So now I'm going to talk about our policy options, and while we don't make specific recommendations, we end the report discussing options to improve Michigan's municipal finance system and specifically its property tax system. Michigan's tax limitations are unique and particularly restrictive. Michigan is one of a few states that uses all 3 types of tax limitations: rate, assessment, and levy limits. Additionally, Michigan's levy and assessment limits both restrict annual increases to the rate of inflation, which is lower than some other states' restrictions. We're going to discuss some policy options aimed at easing these restrictions to allow local governments to see at least inflationary growth in property tax revenues while maintaining the goals and protections for taxpayers. First off, the Research Council has been saying for years that local governments in Michigan are overly dependent on the property tax. No changes to the tax limitations are going to fix that. An ideal tax structure has components that respond to economic growth, like income and sales taxes, and components that are stable, like property taxes. Many other states afford their local units of government several tax options: general and selective sales, income, transportation, tourism, and others, to capture economic activity and create diverse revenue streams. Michigan allows cities to levy an income tax and allows Detroit and some counties to levy certain other local taxes, but otherwise restricts local governments from levying a diverse set of taxes. Providing local governments with more access to local option taxes can be part of the solution to the problems inherent in the local government finance structure. Allowing for sales and use taxes would capture the economic activity that defines many regions through tourism or the retail trade. Income taxes would capture the economic strength of local governments. The problem with this solution at the local level is that the smaller the taxing jurisdiction, the greater the economic competition and administrative costs, which may be why so few cities in Michigan have adopted a city income tax. One potential solution to this problem is to reform state revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was originally adopted in place of allowing for local option taxes. It served to provide local governments with revenues from diverse sources, while centralizing the revenue raising function at the state level. However, this system only works well when it is fully funded and the state cannot divert funds to meet its own budget needs. A diversified tax structure with or without revenue sharing is not a panacea, but could be combined with other reforms like regionalizing service provision to improve the local finance system. Building off the idea of regionalizing services, any new local revenues should be authorized at the regional level to promote regional governance and tax-based sharing. Making these types of changes may provide the foundation for a more stable municipal finance system in Michigan. The next policy option we're going to discuss is directly related to property tax limitations. Eliminating the Headlee Amendment limitation on jurisdiction-wide tax revenue growth was never considered as a public option when Proposal A was adopted in 1994. However, once Proposal A was adopted with its cap on taxable value growth, the need for Headlee tax rate rollbacks became less clear. Growth in taxable value comes from three sources: appreciation, uncapping taxable value at the time of sale, and new construction. If the Headlee Amendment levy limit was eliminated, then individual property owners would still have their yearly tax bills limited to inflation, but property tax millage rates would not be rolled back when property is sold and tax bases pop back up to market value. We use the property tax data that we collected to run models in different communities with both limitations compared to with just Proposal A. Using taxable value without the Headlee Amendment always leads to more revenue collections than both tax limitations together, but the difference is small in some communities. These charts show the variance of the impact of eliminating the Headlee Amendment. In the city of Wixom, a fast-growing community with lots of new development, eliminating the Headlee Amendment leads to only 0.7% more revenue being collected over the entire 25+ year period. You can see the lines are almost identical. The fact that eliminating the Headlee Amendment does not have a large impact in Wixom simply confirms that the tax limitations work well in communities that are growing in population and new development. In Casson Township in Lenawee County, eliminating the Headlee Amendment leads to 19% more revenue collected over the period. And all the other communities fell somewhere between these two examples. Eliminating the Headlee Amendment is easier said than done. First, there is not a lot of political will to alter or eliminate the Headlee Amendment. And second, it is a constitutional restriction and would require amending the state constitution. Michigan's levy limit requires reductions in millage rates when the property tax base grows rapidly, but does not allow for increases in millage rates when the property tax base grows slowly or declines without a Headlee override vote of the people. This was not the case prior to 1993. Headlee roll-ups used to be allowed and could bring the tax rate back up to the originally authorized rate. Again, we used property tax data we collected to run the tax limitation scenarios both with and without roll-ups. We found that allowing for tax rate roll-ups would have led to greater property tax revenue collection in every community. However, the difference in amount of revenue collected with and without roll-ups was not large for most local communities, under 4% over the entire period for all but 2 local governments. The charts show the variance among communities again. In Wixom, allowing for roll-ups only increased potential revenue collection by 0.6% over 26 years. In Ottawa County, allowing for roll-ups would increase revenues by 11%. And all the other communities were in between. The fact that roll-ups do not lead to greater amounts of revenue collected is somewhat surprising, since they are often viewed as something that would provide local governments with access to more revenue. The misconception may arise from the fact that when roll-ups were previously allowed, they were levied on state equalized value because this was pre-Proposal A and pre-taxable value. State equalized value varies with the market, leading to greater growth and greater declines in property values. So when the tax rate adjustments are based on state equalized value, they lead to both greater rollbacks during times of economic expansion and greater roll-ups during times of economic decline. The institution of Proposal A and taxable value have tempered the effect of both rollbacks and roll-ups. If we wanted to instate roll-ups, it's unclear how easily it could be done. They were eliminated by state legislation. which could be amended to allow them once more. However, some believe that the Constitution does not allow for roll-ups since raising tax rates requires a vote of the people. If that's the case, then it would require a constitutional amendment. However, roll-ups were allowed for many years and were never adjudicated. This chart helps to illustrate the difference in tax rate rollbacks in one community, Oakland Township, when using taxable value, the tan line, both limitations, to calculate tax rate rollbacks versus using state equalized value, the teal line, which is just the Headlee Amendment. The tax rate is rolled back much more when it is based on state equalized value rather than taxable value, and most of the rollback occurred prior to the Great Recession. The tax rate starts around 4.2 mils in both scenarios, but is rolled back to just over 2 mils with the Headlee Amendment. When both limitations are in place, it is only rolled back to around 3.3 mils. So once property values started declining in the Great Recession, the scenario using taxable value could levy higher tax rates, ultimately leading to more revenue collection. This provides an example of Proposal A's mitigating effect on the Headlee Amendment restrictions. In Michigan, the growth of local government property tax revenues is pegged to inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. This has grown more slowly than other measures, such as growth in personal income, which is what the Headlee Amendment ties the growth in state revenue to. The Consumer Price Index has grown 305% since 1980. The Bureau of Economic Analysis implicit price deflator has grown 376%, and the statewide personal income has grown 458%. Other states tie growth in property tax revenues to one of those other limits, and Michigan could do the same thing. It's important to consider the best limit from both a local government and taxpayer perspective. From a local government perspective, the implicit price deflator better captures their costs. From a taxpayer perspective, CPI better captures their costs. Growth in personal income may make sense for both groups as it connects to taxpayers' ability to pay, as well as providing for growth in local revenues over time. Michigan could change the measure of growth and still maintain the 5% maximum increase to protect taxpayers during years of high growth. The chart here shows that the statewide property tax burden has been fairly stable around 1.3 to 1.5% of personal income since 1978, with increases during recessionary periods when personal income grew more slowly or even declined as it did during the Great Recession. The years following the adoption of Proposal A in 1994 saw no real change in tax burden relative to income. This is likely due at least partially to some local governments increasing their tax rates. Using personal income as the growth measure might put less pressure on the tax rate. The current CPI limit is written into the Constitution, which makes changing it difficult. It would require the political will to bring this before the people in an affirmative statewide vote. In conclusion, the current property tax limitations are successful in minimizing the tax burden for taxpayers, as well as in increasing predictability and stability for both taxpayers and local governments. It can be argued that due to the Great Recession, the two tax limitations have worked in tandem to minimize the downside risk and mitigate the impact of property value declines, by creating a reservoir of untapped revenue during economic downturns. Notwithstanding these benefits, the data show that the overlapping tax limitations have reduced tax revenue growth and set many local governments on a path for very modest rates of growth. This chart shows statewide taxable value as a percent of statewide personal income. And while it has averaged around 80% prior to the Great Recession, again with spikes during recessions when personal income fell, the average in recent years has fallen to around 70 to 75%. That decline can be at least partially explained by slow growth in taxable value since the Great Recession. Local governments cannot grow their tax base without new development. This has led to a system where governments compete to chase new development and/or continuously increase their tax rates, neither of which is sustainable in the long run. And that concludes my formal presentation. I know this is a really difficult topic with a lot of information, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jill. Again, everyone, you can find the full report on our website, crcmich.org. We got a few questions prior to the show, when people are registering, and we've gotten one in already. I encourage others, if they have any questions from the presentation, type them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We have about 20 minutes. So the first question, real estate markets. I'm in Livonia in Southeast Michigan. I can tell you from personal experience with my daughter that real estate markets have just been crazy over the summer. Just huge escalation in purchase prices above what anyone would thought would be reasonable. At the same time, inflation is going up. We got news today about our pensioners going to get a bump because of inflation. So go over again a little bit how these two factors stand to affect our taxpayers and our local governments. Are the local governments standing to benefit from this hot real estate market?
Not really. We recently published a blog talking about this, and we talk about it in our paper as well. So taxpayers still have, regardless of how much their home value increases, their property value for tax purposes cannot increase by more than inflation or 5%. So if inflation is high, they'll hit that 5% limit. Now, since Proposal A passed in 1994, inflation has never been higher than 5%. So if you stay in your home, your tax bill, no matter how much your property increases, your value for tax purposes will not increase more than inflation or 5%. And that is what creates the growing gap between state equalized value and property value when the market is increasing quite a bit and property values are just increasing with inflation. Now, when people sell their property, they do pop back up to market value. So the new property owners are paying their taxes on state equalized value, and they'll be limited moving forward, but they start back out at market value. The reason that local governments don't benefit as much from this turnover in properties is because, like I said, when property values pop up, the Headlee Amendment treats that as revenue growth. And so the jurisdiction-wide, the whole city of Livonia's revenue cannot increase by more than inflation for any reason except new development. So when that happens, the millage rate is rolled back. So the rollback tends to be small for individual property taxpayers, but it limits the local government from growing property tax revenues.
Let me tag on to this because there was a recent article about the MEDC and their efforts with place-based economic development. And their efforts are largely centered towards developed areas, our cities and our urban townships, where there's already concentrations of people. And the economic development, one would argue, is the right approach to try to revitalize our urban areas and create places where people want to live and work and congregate in parks and street fairs and everything. But when we use this same logic, so the state's investing in these areas with economic development tools, and they're trying to measure what is the effect on the community around there, and they're seeing that in fact leads to some regentrification, some desire to be in those places. But again, the local governments aren't benefiting from it. When those properties, those existing properties sell, they lead to the pop-up, and there's the resulting rollback in tax rates. So one would argue, why are we even doing any economic development? It certainly benefits the state tax base, more sales tax, more income tax, but it's not helping the local governments, and it's sort of tilting at windmills, pumping out this money with no result in growth of the tax base for local governments to provide services. And that's arguably more important in creating quality of place than any of these programs that are being funded with the economic development dollars. Here's another question that you sort of touched on with your review. The question boils down to, would changing revenue raising policy at the state level help cities towards a movement of a diverse revenue stream? Do you want to go over that a little bit again? What are the opportunities and why haven't we seen a diverse revenue stream?
Yes, the answer to the question is yes. Changes at the state level are required for local governments to levy more diverse taxes. Local governments can only levy what the state allows. And right now, it, for the most part, allows them to levy a property tax. It allows cities to levy income taxes, and then allows some other small taxes. So changes at the state level to either allow local governments to levy more different types of taxes, so that local units in regions where we're not, it'd probably be better for a region-based tax, but so regions that are have a lot of tourism could levy more tourism or sales taxes and benefit from that tourism. But it needs to be allowed at the state level before locals can do that. Or as I briefly touched on, the state revenue sharing program was originally an avenue for local governments to receive more diverse revenues without having to deal with the administrative costs and the economic competition with their neighbors and levying these revenues. So the state levied them and then shared them with local governments. That's another option for locals to have more diverse revenue streams, but it can't be at the state so easy for the state to divert those revenues to their budget, because as we can see, revenue sharing has been cut substantially over the years and is no longer providing locals with the diverse revenue streams they need.
All right. So we got a question. When our report focused on cities, villages, and townships, it didn't address schools. Do you want to address the school funding? You want to pass that back to me?
I'll pass that back to you.
Yeah. All right. So the bottom line for school funding is everything is state funded, right? We have local property taxes, but they're sort of a mandatory local tax that has to happen to get your share of the state funding. So by limiting the growth of the property tax base and having these limits, you're constraining the growth of the pie of all money available at the state level to fund education, but you're not affecting how much each school gets. That's how much each school gets is based on the student counts and so much money per student. So the bottom line is we're affecting the amount of funding for all education in the state, but we're not affecting how much goes to Lansing public schools or Grand Rapids schools or Alpena. It affects the big picture of total amount of money. All right, so here's another question. One key driver to Proposal A's adoption was Michigan's property taxes were some of the highest in the country. Have we examined where Michigan stands now, particularly in light of the data you show, the rise of additional tax levies, or perhaps a review of the tax burden would be more useful, comparing Michigan to other states? Jill, do you have that information, or?
I haven't done a recent comparison of Michigan's tax burden to other states, but I did, so we haven't done that state by state look at data recently. We've done it in the past. But just looking at some reports, doing background research for this, Michigan still was ranked pretty high. I think the Tax Foundation had Michigan, having a tax rate, an effective tax rate that was higher than the national average. And I want to say in the top 10, I'd have to look at my report, the report to say, but I from the data I have seen and the reports that I have read, Michigan's property taxes are still fairly high.
Right.
compared to the national average.
And the Lincoln Institute does a report where they look at the true tax burden if you're in the biggest city in every state, as well as in a similarly sized municipality in every state. And if you're a property owner in Detroit, your tax burden is third or fourth in the nation, very high. If you're in Manistee, it is in the top 10 compared to other cities of similarly sized. And again, to us, that goes back to the fact that these other states have a lot more revenue diversity, so they can place less burden on the property tax and you can get the revenue from in other ways.
That's what I was going to say. We've limited the property tax in some ways, but we still, local governments are still dependent on it. So we've just seen, like in Farmington, the increase in dedicated millages in Farmington Hills and other communities because they don't have other options.
And then my friend Mark Perry, that I haven't talked to for many years, asked the question, is there a reason why our study did not include the analysis of the super cap that would have impacted taxable value and taxable revenue growth? He explains that the original blueback defined the super cap as the lower of the percent change of annual increase in SEV, CPI, or 5%. And the original Proposal A implementation bill included percent increase in SEV to smooth out recessionary years, as well as preventing the de facto increase up to 50%. So let me start to respond to this, and then Jill, if you have any thoughts.
Okay.
Mark, the big reason, we had a lot of different scenarios that we thought about, and the more lines you put on a chart, the more complicated it gets. So we tried to boil it down, and when we were going through the analysis, it became very clear that life before taxable value and life after taxable value were very different. And once we started looking at the fact that the taxable value became the tax base, there was not as much upside as Jill demonstrated with the roll-ups, and if you took away the taxable value, if you took away the Headlee rollbacks that occur with new property development. So it just got very complicated the more scenarios we put in, and I don't think we would have seen much different. We could certainly model that sort of scenario and get back to you. But the bottom line is using inflation and limiting taxable value, having the rollbacks when you have change in property, those to us seem like a lot bigger detriments than the super cap. Jill, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think you covered it. We originally had lots of lines in our charts too when we were going through the data, and it's a complicated topic, and we're trying to present it in a way that is as easily understandable as possible.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, we've thought about so you could do the roll-ups, as Jill said, up until 1993, in the bill that triggered Proposal A, the bill that blew up the school finance system, included the cessation of the tax rate roll-ups. So what if we went back to July of 1993 instead of August of 1993 to say what was policy? It matters how you would judge how these systems played out, but it wouldn't make our local governments any better today. So it just got very complicated trying to decide what to display and how to judge these things. We can follow up, Mark. We can follow up offline if you want to investigate this a little more. The final question, I think we haven't had any more come in, so one more from registration. The background on the amendments themselves, its development, who was behind it. So, Jill, starting with the Headlee Amendment, that included more than just the local government tax limitation. Can you sort of give us a big picture of what how that all came together, and then let's talk about the taxable value system.
Yeah, I would say I would categorize the Headlee Amendment as a more general kind of tax revolt amendment. And it added, I think, like I said, 10 sections to the Michigan Constitution, limiting local revenues, limiting state revenues, putting stuff into the Constitution to prohibit the state from if state revenues are limited, prohibit them from then transferring services or functions to local government without providing funds for that. So it had a section on unfunded mandates and things like that. But it was generally a limitation to, or a amendment to limit state and local tax revenue growth. Where Proposal A really started as a school finance reform initiative, and the taxable value part of Proposal A was added kind of more towards the end of the process. And I know Eric has done more background research on Proposal A, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, as I said, we were trying to figure out why the provision was thrown in and how we should do our analysis. And what it boiled down to was Proposal A was very much about fixing school finance up until not only the 11th hour, but 11th hour and 50th minute. It really was a very late in the game addition to the whole thing. And as I understand it, I know there's some people watching that maybe were closer to it than I did, but as the story was told to me, there was concern while you had the Headlee Amendment enacted in 1978 meant to constrain state and local tax revenue growth, as Jill just described. Now they were shifting a lot of the burden to state funding, increasing the sales tax rate, use tax, cigarette tax, a new state real estate transfer tax, all these revenue growths. And they were concerned that while they put in place this limit on local government, that there was sort of this end run. The taxpayers would be affected with higher state taxes. So they came in with this provision that created the taxable value system. And that was a trade-off that Governor Engler, the leadership were willing to make as part of the big picture. Of course, they had to worry about taking this to the voters and getting voter support for it because they were amending the Constitution in more than one way. So there was the political dynamic, but also the realism that they had to get voter support, and they thought that this extra tax limitation would help them get it across the finish line. So I don't know that how many people voted on Proposal A based on the fact that that tax limitation was in place, or even remember that it was there, but it was the end result of it. So we don't have any more questions come in. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we can certainly follow up if this spurred any questions after the fact. As I said, this whole session has been recorded. We post it to YouTube and put the link on our website, so you can certainly find it there if you want to share it with anyone. We're happy to do this presentation if you have conventions, conferences, want others to learn about this, how this is affecting our local governments and our taxpayers. So thank you, Jill, and thank you everyone else. And this concludes the presentation.